As you know, the Meat Eater Live Tour is on April 23rd through May 5th. Chances are in a town near you. What you may not know is you can win tickets to each of these events just by going to a backcountry hunters and anglers pint night. There's going to be a pint night in each of these towns: San Diego, Salt Lake City, Tempe, Anaheim, Boise, Sacramento, Missoula, Portland, Tacoma, where you can compete in Meat Eater trivia and win not only tickets to the show, but a chance to be on stage with all of us. So get your butt to a pint night and we'll see you on stage.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your guide to the whitetail woods. Presented by First Light, creating proven, versatile hunting apparel for the stand, saddle, or blind. First Light, go farther, stay longer. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your guest host, Tony Peterson, and today I'm speaking to Clint Campbell about scouting whitetails at home and on the road. Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, which is brought to you by First Light. You've heard me say this before, and I'll say it again. If you don't have some of the trace clothing, the trace pants, or maybe the quarter zip, and you want to go get some work done in the whitetail woods, you might want to check it out. Super breathable, super durable. It is just the right stuff for early season hunting and for summer scouting and getting your work done. So check it out. You've got it. You've guessed it. Mark's still off. But he's not really doing anything cool this time. He just sent me a text and he said, "Listen, Tony, I have to level with you. I just need to go fly fishing. I've only been on the water 97 days this summer and I'm just itching to get out and catch a few fish." Man, you kind of got to feel sorry for the guy, don't you? I mean, that's barely any playtime. So I hope he catches some fish and he finds a good place to show off his catch on social media, if he's so inclined. And so while he's off tossing dry flies to brownies and cuts, I'm back here keeping the lights on. But it's not all bad, because I get to talk to killer whitetail hunters like Clint Campbell, who happens to be my guest today. Clint hosts the Truth from the Stand podcast. He plays a mean guitar. He's an expert at wrapping people into tiny little bows through his jiu-jitsu skills. And he scouts deer harder than almost anyone you've ever met. That's what we get into today, and he breaks down his strategy for mastering public land whitetails out east and how he approaches traveling hunts when he draws a tag somewhere far from his native Pennsylvania. Clint is honestly a wealth of whitetail knowledge, and I think you're going to love hearing what he has to say. So Clint, as usual, we started talking as soon as we saw each other here, and we've gone through, we've solved most of the world's problems before we even started this podcast, but we should probably get into this and talk a little bit about scouting, huh?
Yeah, talk a little scouting, man. I mean, we've already gone to Mars. We went to Saturn. We won a UFC belt, a title, so. I mean, why not solve deer hunting problems at the same time?
Yeah, we definitely should. And I wanted to have you on for a lot of reasons. I always love talking to you. You've got the Truth from the Stand podcast. You're one of those people who's out there. You're living it. Like you're always sending me pictures, and we're always going back and forth. And we just started talking a little bit off air that you brought up something I want to get into. You mentioned how important winter scouting is to you. And I'm the same way, I feel real cheated this year because we had a nasty winter and you guys had a pretty bad winter and you had some other stuff going on. So you didn't get to take advantage of that window the way that you usually do to feel good about your season. And so you're kind of scrambling now and you have to summer scout at home there in Pennsylvania, like you usually don't have to.
Yeah, I'll be honest and I'll be 100% transparent. The summer is my least favorite time to spend time in the woods. It's hot, it's buggy. I'm getting cobwebs all over my face. I can't see the ground the way I want to see the ground. The rubs now have kind of faded to where it's a lot harder to tell. Was that last year's rub? Was that 2 years ago? So the sign obviously just isn't there. And the nice thing about winter scouting is, when you have all the foliage off the trees, it's like I don't have to walk that extra 75 yards or whatever the case is to go check out this thing over here. If something catches my eye, like a rub on a tree, it's like I can see the discoloration through the open timber at that point, right? A lot of times I can throw some glass on it and I can tell, okay, is that something I'm walking over there for, or am I headed, continuing the direction that I was going anyway, right? Now it's a little different where it's, it's a lot of map reading and kind of finding those spots and then getting to them. And like, if it's thick cover, you maybe only see 10, 15, 20 yards. And so now you're really having to dissect things. It slows it down. You don't cover nearly as much ground. But, with that, you just kind of deal with the cards that you have. And we were talking a little bit yesterday. We were texting a little bit before we knew we were going to be chatting today. And I think I mentioned to you, adaptability is sometimes our best ability, right? Mm-hmm. With deer hunting. And I kind of feel like that's where I'm at now. I talked to, who did I do that podcast with? It might have been, it's actually been a couple of different guys. Like Heath Cisco was one guy, and Mike Perry from Pennsylvania was another guy. And we talked a little bit about the reliance on winter scouting, and like we might rely on it a little bit too much, right? Because it tells you the story of last year. And without being there whenever whatever sign was laid down, you don't really know particularly what week that happened, right? It's like you might be able to tell just based on how close it is to like a food source or like a bedding area or like a specific terrain feature, something like that, that might be like rut sign or that might be like early season sign or whatever the case is. But you really don't 100% know. And so this year it might be a blessing in disguise where it's like I'm going to get out, hang my cameras here in the next couple of weeks, kind of finish hanging those and doing a little bit of scouting, a little bit more exploring on the new piece I've been looking at. But by and large, this year is probably going to be a lot of, boots on the ground come September, October, and starting to figure things out. And so, I'll start to lay the groundwork for that here during the summer. But it'll be a lot of doubling back in the fall to kind of check my premonitions from the summer, if you will.
Yeah. And in your situation, do you hunt any private land?
I do not. Well, I shouldn't say I don't. On an occasion, I mean, my family does own in like central-ish western side of PA, roughly. We have a couple 100 acres between a couple different parcels, but I haven't been back there in probably 4 or 5 years, probably. Other than like a wayward turkey hunt one day with my dad, like 3 years ago. That was about it. But yeah, for by and large, it's all the public either that's around me, a couple hours north of me, or out of state.
Yeah, so where I want to go with this is your style is tied so closely to the kind of terrain you're hunting. Yeah. So you're hunting the mountains of Pennsylvania. You don't have a situation where you're going to grab the spotter and go sit on the edge of a bean field in late July, early August, whatever. So like the importance for you of getting out there winter scouting would be different from some dude saying like maybe Ohio or somewhere like that. And I think that there's an important lesson there because it's so easy for us to hear like, oh, well, I just run trail cameras as a scout, or I just do this, or Zach Fehrenbaugh does this, or whoever does this. But it's so tied to your personal situation.
Yeah.
And 100%. So for you, that winter scouting in that big wood scenario, it's like such an advantage. And then if you lose that, you're like, okay, now I'm scrambling and I got to get a ton of cameras out. And you run a ton of cameras, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll have out, I probably own, I want to say maybe 30 roughly is probably what I have in my arsenal, probably like 9-ish cell cameras, and then the rest are all regular SD card cameras. But on that on the big woods piece, it's like I'll pull, cameras with my buddy Aaron Hepler and my other buddy Tom. We'll all kind of pull our cameras together and like commit X number of cameras to like that spot. And so in that piece alone, we'll probably have between the three of us like 30 plus cameras on there. And we've met some other friends. We get some other friends up there, and we all share intel. I mean, the place is so big. That's the one thing, when you're hunting smaller pieces. So like for me locally in PA, I don't share really intel with anybody locally because it's just like there's not a lot, like the public pieces just aren't real big, and there's a lot of pressure. And I certainly don't put any pictures online of deer that I'm getting on camera or anything like that. If anyone ever sees me share a picture, you can almost guarantee it wasn't from PA, and certainly wasn't from my local area. Me and a couple different guys, like we'll all share intel with each other because the place is so big, we're not going to step on each other, and so I have pictures of deer and, Tom has pictures of deer. I'll send him my pictures and be like, hey, I saw this deer. He was on camera over here. And then we can start to get an idea of like how they're moving. Cause otherwise it always takes about 3 years to figure a spot out roughly. And then you can start to reasonably consider that you should start to have the type of encounters that you want to have. May not kill that third year, but you should at least be in the game. Before that, though, if you don't have any help, you're really throwing a dart at a dartboard, in a lot of ways. And so we try to do the best we can, just kind of help each other out. And it allows us to kind of lay a game plan. You start to understand how deer are starting to use that terrain this place has just wildly open timber, and then all of a sudden you get like really kind of almost like micro habitats where all the sign kind of explodes, where it gets really thick, and they've got some food and they've got some cover, but there might be 2 miles between that and the last place you saw sign. And so to figure all that out on your own, is a task.
So run me through a scenario here, because when I think of like big woods type of hunting, I mean, my big woods type of hunting is a little bit different because I can't run cameras on a lot of the places that I hunt, like in northern Wisconsin, some of the rules and stuff. And so for me, it's so tied to winter scouting, looking for the sign, and then summer scouting, just looking for the sign. Because there's not, I don't have the glassing situation, but you rely so heavily on those trail cameras to do some heavy lifting for you in the summer. So let's say you go out and you're like, you don't have this current winter scouting situation where you're like, okay, I know I'm going to go drop a camera here, here, and here because of what I saw. You're going in now. Let's say you're bringing in a half a dozen cameras or whatever. What are you hanging them on? Are you looking at like terrain traps? What are you doing here?
Yeah. So that's a very good question, because that's exactly where I'm at. Because where I had run cameras in the past. So one thing I will do is I'll rely on like historical data. All the cameras I typically run, I leave out for a year, and then I go back and I gather them, and I might check them in the fall, but by and large they stay out for the year. And I start to just get a sense of like, one, how often am I seeing new deer in the fall, and how often am I finding home bodies? And what I've kind of found, at least on this big piece, is that I get a lot more home bodies than I do on smaller parcels for whatever reason. And so if I have 5 good bucks, on a camera, let's say, in this big woods piece, chances are 3 of them will probably be around in the general area whenever fall rolls around. Where locally for me, if I have 5 good bucks on camera in the summer in an area, I'll be lucky if 1 sticks around. You know what I mean? For whatever reason, that's just something that I've noticed. So most of the place that I've kind of focused on the past 2 years is really challenging spot to hunt. And there's another area that I hung a couple cameras, let them run for like the past 2 years, hadn't hunted it once because it seemed like it was the easiest access. I always had great deer on camera, but in the back of my mind is always like, man, this place is going to get pounded because it's the easiest access. Seems like the most logical place for someone to jump in if they wanted to do a quick hunt. But in the course of 2 years, I think I might have had 3 people on camera, and all of them were during gun season. And so I'm like, all right, so archery season, we're kind of in play. So I need to kind of expand on that piece. And so what I'm really kind of looking for, especially in this particular area, is there's not a lot of undulation in terrain in this particular area because you're already kind of on top of the mountain, so to speak. And so really what I'm looking for is just very slight variations in change in elevation. So it might only be like a 10-foot rise or something like that that's just going to kind of funnel deer around an area. Because I found one spot like that, and that's where I found a lot of deer traffic. The other part is finding, this is again using a little bit of intel from the 1 or 2 cameras I did have in that area the past 2 years, is that most of the bucks that I was seeing, they actually had like black up to like mid shin, if you will. And there's a handful of like swamp areas that are around there. And so whenever I was watching these pictures of these bucks come through, last fall, it's funny because I wasn't even looking at their head at first. I was looking at their feet to see if they had mud on their feet, And so when I started seeing like the younger deer that would come through, I didn't see that as consistently. All the bigger deer that I had come through, almost all of them had dirty legs. And so it's like I started then looking around going, okay, where are like the swampy kind of areas, and not so thick that you can't get through, but like where are the spots that look kind of open just from, looking on a map, e-scouting. And then from there, what I started looking for were just kind of like little land bridges between swampy areas to kind of go investigate, and then I started thinking, so that was the first thing. What are the land bridges? And so I'll investigate those. And then the other part was just looking at my prevailing wind and knowing that I get a south, southwest, west kind of predominant prevailing wind during that time of year. And then looking at the opposite side of those swamps and those areas going like, all right, are there any terrain features there that are going to kind of funnel them down toward the edge of that swamp, or is it flat? They can kind of meander out, and I just need to kind of go investigate that stuff. But I'll start on that side of the swamp knowing that that's going to be my predominant wind, and that'll be my most likely tree locations that I would want to find to be able to play the wind.
When you're running cameras, can you see those bucks have muddy feet on there too, or not?
Yeah, that's how I pick
it up. How you see it. It's not in.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think it was Steve Bartell that wrote an article one time years ago. I might even edit it when I was at Peterson's bow hunting, but he said big bucks have wet feet. And I've thought about that because it's so freaking true. I want to back up a second because you said something about, running cameras on bigger properties and home bodies versus running cameras on smaller properties and not necessarily any. It's easy to find a home body there. Don't you think that's just tied to the amount of a deer's like home range that you have to work with?
I think it's that. And I think, and this is just, look, I don't claim to be smart enough to know this for a fact. It's just, these are just kind of my hypothesis or my hypotheses. But if I were to venture a guess, I think it's one, yes, they have so much more room and they have so much more kind of like available to them that why would you completely change home ranges? There's likely multiple doe families within that area already that they're using for food and cover, just kind of in general, right? And then I think the second part of it is that food is so sparse there that I think that they just kind of move around like as the food changes, and as opposed to like going like 3 properties over or whatever, they're just staying in that general area because there's a patch of oaks here. And then in the summer, there's a bunch of wild blueberries and raspberries, because I see that a lot, especially in and around those swampy areas where it's like those deer just bed in there and live in that area until the bears run them out, and then they'll come back essentially. And then I think the other part is that they make such, even when they are doing a little bit of traveling, they make such long cycles that if you're impatient, you'll think they have left. But if you really think about it and you see them kind of come back, it's like, instead of it being like a 3-day window where you catch them, it might be a 5, 7, 8-day window.
Yep.
And so that's the other thing, like when you're on big pieces, I just had to kind of learn painfully over time, is that just because they haven't been around for 8 days, maybe even 10 days, depending, I just might be in the wrong little, 500 acre chunk. They might be playing this 100 acre piece over here just to my east or whatever. They've not left the area. They're just not in this particular chunk.
Yep.
And that's what I've seen. And when I say home body, it's not that I've caught that deer on camera, the same camera consistently. I might have during the summer and then maybe a couple times during the fall, but I had a camera that was a quarter of a mile away, kind of like a cast the net. And it's like, I caught him on 2 other ones over here all fall long, plus the one I had him on originally in the summer, like 3 times.
Yep.
Right. So I'm going, he's maybe not bedded in the same exact spot because, foliage has come down, bedding situations change, but he's still at home. He hasn't completely left, and so that's kind of what I've seen, at least on that big woods piece.
Yeah. I think there's a really valuable lesson in that, where when you talk about using trail cameras to scout, and I had to figure this out the hard way. When I started hunting a lot of small properties, like 20 to 40 acre type of chunks, the randomness to deer movement feels so real, especially when you're trying to find a decent buck. You're like, man, he was here September 27th and he wasn't back until October 16th. And one time he was here in the day, one time he was here at night. And it's like, yeah, because you might be hunting 5% of his home range, or 3. If you get into a big wood scenario where you talk about with limited food and lots of cover, you might have a home range that's 900 acres, and now you're hunting 20 acres of it or 40 acres of it. And I think it's hard for us to wrap our heads around that. Sometimes we go, well, he's just totally nocturnal or he's not moving. And it's like, man, you're just playing with a little tiny piece. It'd be like if you were looking for somebody in a house and you could only stay in like one closet. And you're like, they're not home. And you're like, spin around in the closet. And you're like, well, you can't look in the living room. You can't go downstairs. And I think the big lesson there is to be really careful about trail camera usage as far as like what you deduce out of that. Like you said, if you're working some big cover, you've got 1,000 acres or 5,000 acres of big woods to work, and you get a picture of him here, and then a month later a picture of him here, and you can draw a line between them, and you go, okay, we're within a third of a mile, quarter of a mile, whatever. Like now you're starting to pin down what could be considered like some level of core area. Like now you have something to work with. It's vastly different than being on 30 acres and going, I got 2 pictures of him, and guess I'm going to sit here. Like you got to, like you said, you got to work with what you're, like the hand you're dealt, and it's different.
Yeah. And that 2 pictures on a piece the size of this big woods piece, like that's like, for me, that's money in the bank, especially if I get them at 2 different times of the year. That's all I really need at that point. It's like, if I get him in the summer and know he's around, right? And then I get him again October 15th. That's all I need. I don't need any more pictures of him. I know he's going to be here at all fall. He might transition, around winter, take an excursion during rut. Even though it's just interesting because I was re-listening back to like some stuff I did with Dr. Bronson Strickland from MSU Deer Lab. And the idea, and this kind of changed how I looked at my trail camera data too. And just knowing that, we think that the deer are more predictable and patternable, in October, earlier in the year, for example, right? Like they're still on like maybe a pseudo bed to food ish pattern. They've not completely got all ramped up and started thinking about chasing does and stuff like that. And then we think when rut happens that all of a sudden, like they go berserk and they're running all over the place and they're bedding in like various places, every day. Every day there's a different bed, right? But the data actually suggests the opposite. They're way more sporadic and unpredictable in October in their bedding patterns, and they're way more predictable when the rut happens, right? Well, they don't have data on this, but he and I talked about it, and I was like, doe families, right? He's like, don't have data, but I would put any amount of money that mattered to me that, their consistent bedding is tied to like doe families that they're hanging around, right? And I would say maybe that doesn't go for younger bucks, but I think older bucks, get smart and get hip to the game, right? And so, because I've talked to, this is something like I saw this play out this year too, and this taught me two different lessons that I kind of knew academically, but really kind of, made them concrete for me. John Eberhardt a lot would talk about hunting over scrapes, and especially when you're scouting, trying to find a scrape, it's hard to during the summer sometimes. But if you can find a good community scrape, a dominant buck in the area will likely at some point probably come bed not far from that scrape and wait for does to come through and hit that scrape. And he's going to scent check them as they're coming through as opposed to chasing them. Right. So it's the old adage of like, in my 20s or 30s, we were out running like crazy men, right? Crazy people. And now I'm 45 and I'm like, nah, man, I'm just happy to sit home and hang out. You know what I mean? And it's a similar type of thing. It's like, why work harder when you can work smarter? And so last year I was hunting one of my favorite kind of community scrape areas, and the target deer I wanted to kill locally walks in, beds down about 40 yards from the scrape, about 35-ish yards from me, and was downwind of that scrape and just was sitting there scent checking that scrape for 2 hours, bedded, sleeping, nodding off, waking up, readjusting, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the one kind of academic lesson I learned in real time, was that one, yes, those older deer will kind of bed downwind of that and they won't even come to the scrape, right? So which gives credence to hunting the places in between those kind of destination spots. And then the second one was, I got him on camera. So this ties back to our summer thing. I got him on camera. The last time was like September 15th, right? Never again did I get that deer on camera the rest of the season. But he was comfortable enough to bed 40 yards from that scrape and walked in and he knew what he was doing.
Yep.
So that time I got him on camera, was that the only time he was ever there until the time that he showed up at that bed? If I were a betting man, I would say not.
Yeah.
Right?
No way.
He's just he's consistently going to be in that general area until the doe that needs to get bred in that area is bred. Yep. Right? And so that deer's consistently there. So it just kind of goes back to what I was saying, where it's like, I don't need more than 2 pictures. I just need the 2 pictures to be at the right time to know that that deer's home range is in that area. And that may not be true for everybody. That's just kind of how I look at it. And it's not the gospel, but it's how I kind of approach it.
Well, that lesson there is one probably for a different podcast. We could do an entire thing on it. But I think that we look at the rut so wrong most of the time. Like you said, Eberhardt's talking about how, look at the strategy there. If you know that there's doe is going to come through there, there's no reason to go wear yourself out looking for them when they'll come to you. It's like, I've written about this a whole bunch, but I see bass, like I bass fish a lot, and I see them adopt 2 strategies to hunt. One of them is they ambush and they sit in a stump, like next to a stump or a dock, and they use the shadows to their advantage and they wait for something to crawl into their world and they eat it. Or, you see this with a lot of younger ones, they'll form a little wolf pack and they go looking. And they go find that school of minnows to chase or find a place where the crayfish are. And it's like 2 different strategies. But the old ones, like the big ones, you don't see them out like schooling up, burning a bunch of energy to do what they could do without burning a bunch of energy. And I mean, I'm dumb. I'm a slow learner. So every year I go out and I hunt the rut. And 5,000 times in a couple weeks during the rut, I'm like, why aren't there deer running all over the place? And this happened to me last year when I was hunting southwestern Wisconsin, where I'm like, I know I'm around a ton of deer. This area has a ton of deer, and I'm like blanking or, seeing very little. And it's like, if you look at this on paper, there's no reason for a buck to have to work that hard there. So you'd think like some kind of chase is going to end up in your lap or some kind of cruiser, but it's just not necessarily the case, especially if they're not way spread out and there's not a lot of competition. Why would they? And, and then you say like, well, some of the scrappers are going to come through, and like that's what happens. Like you sit all day and you see like a forky or, like you're in like a primo spot and that little basket rack 6 comes through, but it's not the chase fest that we always assume it's going to be, because that's just not how nature works most of the time.
Yeah, there was a couple things like going back to like summer scouts. Like the one thing that I started doing, regardless of whether it's winter or summer, is if I find a really, really good kind of community scrape area, it always gets a camera. Even if I see like something in the summer that looks to me like, okay, I can still see that there's some licking branches broken, that this is obviously something that they're using it as a scrape and they're hitting a licking branch, and especially if there's a couple rubs that are around it, that to me kind of is like, okay, this is worth a camera, and I'll just see what happens, and I'll qualify scrapes that way, where I'm just going to hang it, I'm going to let it run for the whole year, and then if I see deer hitting it during the summer, then I know like, okay, Yahtzee, this is like a communication hub, and then we just have to figure out how good it is or if it turns on at a certain time. The other thing I started doing, and I learned this from actually hunting with my buddy Chad in this big woods piece in Ohio, because there was this area that he got this one deer. I think it was this deer we called Chrysler, because there was a guy that used to hunt there. His last name was Chrysler, I believe. And it was just like this really small spine back. And like, so the does would always run like this spine back, right? And like, you would never see deer during daylight in there, really ever, right? It was always kind of like nighttime. But there was this giant bed that was just like off that spine back, maybe 4 or 5 foot in the brush, that was just huge and like worn to the dirt. But we would never get a picture of a buck in there like any other time of year other than like the rut, right? And so it was kind of a rut bed. It was like, interesting, rut bed. Does traveling this a lot, makes a lot of sense. He can sit here and just pick does off. Okay, cool. Another area, there was this big primary scrape that we would just get like these hammer bucks on. Like one of them was like a world-class animal. And 2 years we've watched this scrape and like hunted in and around it and stuff like that, and nothing ever really happened. And we were scouting the following year, and I just happened to be on the leeward side of that ridge behind that scrape, about 60 yards down the side of the ridge as we were coming up, because we went all the way around the ridge, and then we were coming back up, and our rendezvous point was kind of like to come up and meet right around that scrape, because it was in this like old log yard. And as we're coming up, there's like a giant bed that's perfectly downwind of where that scrape was at, about 60 yards from it, like on this little bench. So I pull up my map real quick, and I'm looking, I'm like, you gotta be kidding me, man. I'm like, this thing is like literally right below that scrape. And so, not a big surprise, all of a sudden, that rut rolls around, or pre-rut, or whatever time frame, and a buck starts bedding there, waiting to catch does and just scent checking and never has to move, right? So now what I started doing is, when I find these community scrapes, I don't take a ton of time, but I take like a quick like 30 minutes and just kind of like do like a pinwheel out from that community scrape, and just start pinwheeling my way out to where I get maybe 30, 40, 50 yards in all directions out from it, to see if there's a bed that's around there somewhere that a deer might use during the rut, right? To see, like, because I don't think every scrape is not created equal, but certain ones, when you get spidey sense, if you pinwheel out, all of a sudden you'll find that bed that they'll use as like that rut bed. And so that's what I found last year. I could have never found it because it's so thick and swampy in this area. But whenever I walked in there to hang a camera 2-3 weeks, or to check the camera I had in there 2 or 3 weeks ago, I went back to see where that deer was at. And sure enough, there's a bed there. There's a down log. There's an easy way for him to get in, an easy way for him to get out. It's like a perfect setup, right? And so that's the other thing I started doing. Like even in the summer, when I find those areas, I just kind of pinwheel out and see if I can't locate a bed that's somewhere close by.
As you know, the Meat Eater live tour is on April 23rd through May 5th. Chances are in a town near you. What you may not know is you can win tickets to each of these events just by going to a backcountry hunters and anglers pint night, There's going to be a pint night in each of these towns: San Diego, Salt Lake City, Tempe, Anaheim, Boise, Sacramento, Missoula, Portland, Tacoma, where you can compete in meat eater trivia and win not only tickets to the show, but a chance to be on stage with all of us. So get your butt to a pint night, and we'll see you on stage.
You bring up an interesting point there, and I look at like probably 95% of scrapes like they do me no good.
Yeah.
But the 5% that do, I really like, and they're always tied. Like what you're talking about, you treat them a little bit differently than I do. But what you're saying is, you have this community scrape. It's in a spot where a buck can bed downwind. He can wait for the action to come to him. He doesn't have to go to it. He could probably wait for the little scrappers to chase by and engage that situation or whatever.
Yep.
But all of that is tied to some kind of travel hub. Like all 100%. Of it is tied to a place where the deer just like to go and be. So what you're saying is like, that scrape is like, it tips you off. Like it's like, that's the one thing where you're like, okay, now I need to investigate this spot. But most people think, well, there's a big community scrape here with a good looking branch. I'm going to hunt this. But what does that scrape like signify? Like what's going on in that area that like matters more? And what it is it's a hub. Those are going to be located in a place where deer move morning and evening.
Yep.
And for multiple reasons, they come through there, usually from different directions. And there's just like a high odds chance of being around traveling deer where those show up.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's like when I was a kid, you'd hang out in the parking lot of like the Burger King or whatever. It's the Burger King hangout for deer. You know what I mean? Like they're just, it's like there's so many things that kind of connect in those spots. It's like if you're in hill country, it's some type of thermal hub, right? It's a lot of times where multiple ridges are kind of coming together and they're all kind of dumping down into this bottom at the same spot, right? And it's really easy for the deer to be able to smell everything that's happening on every ridge. And so all of a sudden, a lot of deer congregate there, and then they start leaving sign there. Their scent is there. They lay down a scrape, and that becomes like a central hub. I 100% agree with you. Like they're not all huntable. What I do, going back to what we were talking about with summer, what I'll use, if you're like me and you're a working guy, I have to time my hunts and be very strategic about the days I'm going to get out, right? And so that's why I focus a lot on scrapes, because I can usually predict not what's going to happen directly at that location, although sometimes I can, but I can predict what's going to happen in the general area much better if I have a really good scrape in that spot to kind of start to be my barometer for the area, if you will. Yep. Right. And so what I'll do during the summer and what I'll use summer for is I hang my cameras on those scrapes, and people are like, well, you're hanging cameras on scrapes in the summer. It's like, well, yeah, but what I want to see is that if there aren't any deer hitting it during the summer, then I'm like, okay, that's just like a rut, pre-rut scrape. It might be decent. It might not be. If it's not connected to something else that's nearby that's really kind of trips my trigger, then it's probably not worth a hunt, unless there's like a terrain feature that's close by that like is really good that I want to hunt. But if I get deer hitting that thing almost daily during the summer, I'm like, this is like a main kind of artery for deer activity, regardless of whether it's that scrape. The things in this area are things that are drawing deer to it on a daily basis, regardless if it's does, bucks and velvet, whatever the case is, deer just want to be here. So whenever I see that, that's whenever I start to pay a lot of attention to it. And it's not like they hit it once or twice. It's like I'm looking for multiple days a week during out of season, right, that they're hitting these scrapes. And those are the ones I'll prioritize. And I try to find those on every piece I have. And then what I do is I use that summer intel. I watch the fawn drops. I try to find if there's an early fawn drop, which the one I do know that I have is an early fawn drop. So that's why the 18th of every October, I'm in that spot, because the past 2 years I've had an encounter with my target deer on the 18th in that spot, right? Because that doe's getting ready to come in and she's bred somewhere between the 15th and the 20th. And so I use the fawn drop data during the summer for the upcoming hunting season to kind of know when these spots are going to come in. And then I watch them during the rut as well to understand, when are these doe groups actually cycling in, because they'll cycle in the same every year. And so I just watch these scrapes and I start dating these scrapes going, all right, this week for this scrape, this week for this scrape, this week for this scrape. And then I don't waste my time hunting in an area where I don't have does that are warming up that are going to attract deer for me. You can't bait in PA. I wouldn't anyway, but that's the closest thing you can get to getting an attractant to bring a buck in, is to know when those does estrus states are. And I do that by kind of, just dating the scrapes.
Man, that's high level. I want to take a step back here a second.
Yeah.
And because you brought up something a while ago that I made a note on that I want to talk about because I've been thinking about it a lot. And you were talking about elevation, and you were talking about like the subtlety to terrain and like finding the difference of, 10 feet in elevation or 20 feet or 30 feet, how important that is. And I'm starting to get to the point. This is something, I grew up hunting the bluffs in southeastern Minnesota, and I love bluff country stuff. Like I like the terrain traps, and I like that style. But where I live, and I've lived the last 17 years, is pretty freaking flat, but not like pool table flat. And I started to just appreciate, if there's a little bit of a rise in the woods, or there's like, I'll give you an example. This kind of hit me right over the head this turkey season. So this farm that I've been turkey hunting the last few years, pretty flat, right? There's not much to it, but there's one field on there. There's one field left that we can hunt because it's being developed, and it's got this little rise in it that comes out of the woods. It's kind of on the edge of a cattail swamp. It's actually kind of between two cattail swamps, and it's maybe an elevation change of like 6 feet. But if you walk out on it, you can see everything on that side of the field. You can look from one end to the other. And so scouting turkeys, I would see turkeys strut on there all the time. And so this year, I put a blind on there for the kids. Took my daughter in there. She killed a bird in there. Took my nephew in there. He killed a bird in there. Took his dad in there. He killed a bird in there. Jeez. And it's just a spot where they expect to see turkeys. And they're just so visible. So it's like it's got that going for it. And then I was thinking, I'm like, man, the buck I shot last year with my muzzleloader was standing right here. Out of all the places he could have come out of the woods, he picked that, and he was a little scrapper, but he's like, there's that just difference because he knows if he walks out there, he can look down there all the way to the end of the field, and he can look the other way to the end of the field. And I think we don't appreciate how like tuned into those tiny little elevation differences all those deer are out there.
Yeah. It's hunting the flat kind of terrain is something that it drives me crazy, to be honest with you. And it was something I had to get used to locally, because locally where I live in eastern PA is flat. Where I hunt in the north, there's mountains, and so it's very like there's extremes, right? Here it's like, you don't even rarely get that little 5 foot, 10 foot elevation change. Here it's like, you're dealing with primarily, using transition lines and hard edges that are set by swamps or whatever the case is. But I think sometimes, I was talking to, there was a fella I talked to from Virginia, and he hunts a very similar kind of terrain where it's a lot of flat, but just like with little knobs and knolls. And he was like, anything that had like 5 to 10 foot elevation, man, he's like, you could almost, they might not be bedded there, but they're going to spend time there. And something kind of, I don't remember if he's the one who said it or if someone else mentioned it to me. It's like we often forget that deer a lot of times want the same things we want. It's like we want to be fed, we want to be safe, we want cover, a house, or a shelter of some sort, right? They're looking for the same things. They just go about getting it a little bit differently. We want to be able to see, right? We want to be able to observe. Well, they want the same thing. You know what I mean? And so they'll go to the place where they can. It's not when you think about it that way, it's not a surprise if you're thinking about, the hunting beast style of things, right? The Dan Enfald approach of like, setting up on like the leeward edge of a ridge, knowing that deer want to spend time there. It's like, well, yeah, they're going to bed with the wind that's coming over their back, and they're going to look down directly where they came from, because now they're covered in all directions, right? It's like the one reason is because they got the visual, right? It's like, and I think we oftentimes discount the visual element of their protection because we focus so much on the smell aspect. We spend so much time trying to beat their nose. I think we oftentimes get beat by their eyes, and that's been true for me, in Kansas for sure, because I've been to Kansas the past 2 years. I drew the tag again this year to go back. And that's the hardest part for me out there. It's like, I've been within bow range, and we'll say 15 yards and under all 3 years, but I've gotten beat by their eyes, and never once have I been beaten by their nose yet. You know what I mean? And so that to me was a thing that kind of just pointed out to me, like those little rises, there's little changes in elevation, especially when you're out there, make all the difference, between you being skylit or them skylighting themselves, or them getting into like a little, a little ditch and they're 200 yards away and you're glassing them, and then they seemingly disappear in something that looks flat. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just those little undulations, and we overlook them. But, you know, we'd be fools to think that the deer don't know exactly where those things are at and know exactly when and how to use those.
Oh man. When you talk about that stuff, I think about so many situations in my life. And I think one of the easiest ways to understand this is if you have the opportunity to glass in the summer. So, you know, sit that alfalfa field, sit that bean field, whatever, and watch what you see. And so pay attention, because we go out and we go, I want to find that bachelor group and I want to watch them. But the real benefit, besides finding them, of course, is how do they use the land? Like, are they tucked into a little drainage to feed so you can't see them? Or like, how did they come out of the woods? Or how did they travel from one point of the woods to the other? When you start watching deer actually move through the landscape, it's not just a bedding thing, man. Like, they're using little tiny, almost insignificant folds in the terrain to their advantage. And they probably don't even think about it. It's probably just like a gene deep thing. But when you watch them do that stuff, it's the same thing like I talked about the turkeys. Like, oh, yeah, they strut in a field. No, they strut right there.
Right.
Like, yeah,
that spot.
Yeah, you can see them anywhere at any given point, maybe. But if you want consistency, which is what we're all looking for when we're scouting, we're not looking for a one-off encounter. We're looking for high odds places. That stuff matters so much. And so, yeah, like you said earlier, the advantage of bedding, you know, I mean, if there's a 6-foot rise and it's otherwise flat, that's a better spot for them to bed than almost anywhere else. Just for that, because if they can use the prevailing wind and they can use their eyes and they're just a little bit above everything else, that's a win. Like, and if they can travel in certain ways and use that stuff, the more that you figure that kind of stuff out, like the more you figure out how they use the terrain that way, like, it just opens up a different world to you. And you can take that, like you said, you know, you go from Pennsylvania to Kansas, your scouting opportunities are so vastly different. But those little usages of the terrain, and you know, those deer that live in open country will teach you a lesson about how they use like a little fold in the terrain. I mean, it is mind-blowing when you hunt them in that open terrain, how easily they can disappear or how many deer can hide from you, where you're like, there's no way. Like, I would see every coyote out there, and then you figure it out and you go, man, there was a whole little herd of them in the same section as me that I had no idea till I walked over this little lip of a ridge.
Yeah. Yeah. You're 100% right, man. And there's like an approach that I have, like whenever I'm, you know, e-scouting for Kansas, that I kind of like, don't want to say I developed it. Actually, I kind of, I don't want to say I learned it, but I kind of was tipped off by just through a conversation with Eddie Claypool. I know you're good buddies with Eddie. And but to go back to, before I get to that, the one thing about terrain, like, so when I'm thinking about that north piece, those small little kind of undulations or high spots, they become really, really important, especially the spot that I'm going to be spending a lot of time in this summer and then hunting this fall, in and around those swampy areas, because that little 3-foot, 5-foot rise, that is the primo bedding opportunity in those wet areas. And that's also in those areas where I'll find those land bridges that are kind of connecting two swamps, or like the passageway between two swamps and stuff like that. And that's really the only high ground until you get out of the swamp, right? And so it's those things that kind of dictate the movement of the deer, dictate the bedding opportunities and stuff like that. And so I start to try to focus on those things. The second part in that big woods piece that I started kind of focusing in on are almost like these big, like what I'll call like just big drainages or big draws that are kind of cut into the side of the mountain, where it probably has a stream runoff in it whenever there's a bunch of melt in the winter or whatever. What I've found is that I found a lot of trails and sign that are following those drainages almost up to the top of those drainages. And so I started kind of focusing in on those, and lo and behold, found a hammer scrape whenever I was there, like the mid-ish May, hung a cell camera on it, and sure enough, a deer that had like pop can sized bases already and was already splitting a brow on like May 11th showed up on that scrape. You know, so there were two things there. It was like that draw that's kind of dictating the movement, right? And also a scrape there, knowing that, okay, there's a terrain feature there. It's also near a logging road or like a bench that they're using. So there's two, you know, avenues of travel. And then deer are using it during the summer consistently. And so I'm like, Yahtzee. I'm like, that is a spot that I'll be spending time. And it's a bitch to get into because you have to climb the side of a mountain. So the thermals are really kind of odd where you can really only get in the morning when your thermals are falling, and it's an all-day hunt. Like you can't really get in the afternoon to hunt it. It's got to be a morning sit and an all-dayer, or a morning hunt and you're out type of thing. But pivoting to the Kansas thing, the thing I started like, so I live too far away from Kansas to drive there to scout during the summer. The first year we were fortunate, my buddy Chad went out and he actually turkey hunted the first year before we went there. And so we got a little bit of the lay of the land, a little bit. But what I really kind of have to rely on is just looking at maps over the course of the summer, and it's all walk-in access stuff. So it's not like, I have like a big piece of private or a big chunk of public that I'm going to have 50,000 acres to hunt. I'm going to be hopping pieces. So it's a lot of like looking at small parcels and stuff like that. And what I started doing was really kind of focusing on areas that have a drainage system that kind of runs through it. And what I kind of figured out with talking with Eddie the one time is we were kind of talking about it. And, Eddie's a little bit of a different animal where he goes out in like the middle of like a blue stem patch, like field, and will sit up in like the only tree that's out there, and the deer will just magnetically walk toward that tree. Right. But I was asking him about bedded bucks, and he was like, well, bedded bucks, oftentimes during the rut, because he knew I was going out there in the rut, he's like, they'll cut these does out and they'll take them to the heads of these drainages. You know what I mean? I was like, okay. He's like, but it's not the main drainage. He's like, when you get in there and you look at a drainage, he's like, there's drainages that have like these little offshoots, like tributaries that are running off of them and stuff like that. He's like, it's usually in one of those like secondary offshoots off the main drainage because they're usually the most brushy. He's like, and that's usually where they'll want to cut deer out too. And I just kind of paused for a second, and I was like, that drainage is just an inverted ridge. I was like, and so those offshoots of those secondary kind of tributaries of that drainage are secondary ridges. He's like, well, by God, you're right. It's like one of those things, like I never thought of it that way. And so then all of a sudden it made sense to me on how to scout it and how to look at it, because it was just an upside down ridge. And those, if you have a west wind, that east side, tributary off of that main drainage, that's your spot. You know what I mean? Because that's the place where they're going to have everything under control. They're going to be able to smell everything and be able to see what they need to see. You got to backdoor it, but that's the area they're going to want to play. And so I've seen that kind of play out last year, because I relied on that approach, was just like scouting, east scouting and kind of finding these drainages and then heading to those drainages, to the heads of those, and kind of looking for those kind of like offshoots, and then kind of setting up in those areas. And that's where I was having my encounters and where I was seeing, and if I wasn't having the encounter, I was glassing the deer in those areas before I went in to actually make a move.
When you're hunting them, are you sitting on the ground?
Yeah, 100% on the ground for those.
No trees to get into.
No. I mean, there was one tree in this creek bottom I was able to get into, a thorny ass locust tree. And, I did that like one day and I was like, yep, not doing that again. But all my encounters have been on the ground. It's like I've not had any good encounters with quality, with good age structured deer. I've had like the one day I was in a tree the first year I was there, and I had like a decent buck kind of like walk right underneath of me. But like anything that I was willing to draw my bow back on have all been on the ground.
Yeah. And I mean, there's an obvious reason for that, right? Like
I was in spots that are just hard to wiggle your way into. Yeah. You know what I mean? It was like, and that's the name of the game out there, is like you try to find, because you think it's all flat, but there's a lot more roll to it than you think, and so you really kind of have to examine, especially when you're doing all your e-scouting, and kind of like be very mindful of like that little rise, that little roll is a big deal when you get out there. Like I look at it, and if I have my Pennsylvania brain on, I overlook it.
Yep.
But I got to kind of shift my mindset when I start looking at that stuff over the summer as I'm getting ready to go out there. Because like a lot of times I'll be like, I'm not dropping a pin there. Then I have to go, hey, put your Kansas brain on. You need to drop a pin there. You need to probably walk that, because that's probably a little bit more significant than you think it is, And so that's really my approach for out there.
Dude, that is a real common problem if you head to a state like Kansas and you haven't hunted that kind of terrain. I mean, obviously not the whole state's like that, but you look at it like e-scouting and you go, okay, there's a drainage here, whatever. Like I'll go glass that quick and I'll check this spot out. And there's a few trees in the creek bottom here. And then you get out there and you see the scope of that terrain, and it's big country where, those drainages are way bigger than you think. And yet you still have the opportunity to blow everything out so fast. So it's like a weird, you're right. You have to kind of reconfigure how you look at this stuff. It's not like you're walking into a section of timber and you're like, I'm going to find a concentration of sign and start hunting. It's a totally different animal. And I think it's so important to try to hunt different styles like that or different terrain, because it just teaches you like what you think, like you said, when you look at that stuff on your e-scouting, you're like, maybe, maybe not. And then you go look at it in real life and you're like, man, I just dismissed the better part of half a section because e-scouting, it doesn't look like the stuff I typically e-scout. Then you get out there in the real world and you're like, you could tuck 5,000 booners in there and not be able to see them from the road. Like it's a different thing. I love that kind of stuff because it just challenges you to like your worldview changes a lot when you start getting into that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So whenever I'm in Kansas, or a place that has that, just flat terrain, my focus really in e-scouting and stuff is really primarily on figuring out how to try to find a spot to get into an area that I want to hunt so I can actually glass and get a visual before I kind of tromp into a place, just because you don't know what's kind of, laying in the head of that draw or what's out in this CRP field that you kind of need to make your way through or whatever the case. Keeping the wind in your face is the easy part out there. The hard part is trying to get to a visual vantage point because everyone thinks it's flat, but it's not. So it's trying to figure out how to get into a spot without blowing everything out so I can actually glass and get a visual on where I want to get to without alerting the deer that I'm trying to kill that I'm there. And so that to me is kind of the game within the game out there, so to speak. And really where a lot of my time is spent, e-scouting.
Well, and what that makes me think of, and a lot of the stuff you've said, is we look at deer scouting as like, I got to find the deer. I got to find my target buck, or I got to find a bachelor group, or I got to find a concentration of deer. But that's like foundational, that's like basics. Like, sure, you want to know he lives there or he walked through there one time or whatever, but like figuring out how to hunt those spots is what scouting does for you. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to identify a target buck and give him a name. Good enough. Like, no. And when you talk about this Kansas thing, finding where the deer should be is pretty easy. Like you can e-scout and look at it and go, like there probably should be a concentration in this drainage and a concentration in that one. But figuring out how to work against that disadvantage of you being so much more visible than they are, even though it's open country and theoretically you kind of should be on the same level, you're not. Like that's what the scouting, like that's what you need to figure out. Like you need to figure out how to get in there without them seeing you, because their advantage there is so much greater. It's different than when you're home at Pennsylvania and you're like, I can walk through the woods and a lot of stuff's not going to be able to see me because I'm in the woods. Now I got to figure out where are they going to go to find does, or where are they going to go to get away from the rest of the pressure. Like that's a different game than scouting that Kansas ground, finding a buck there. And I think we've kind of done a disservice to the hunting community by there's been a lot of hunting content that comes out of spot and stalk Kansas bucks. And you're looking at guys finding a buck, getting in there and shooting it. And it's action packed and it looks amazing, but you're not looking at the days and days of glassing where they're just not on them, or they're seeing deer where they're like, there's a great buck. I have no chance of getting anywhere near him and I got to go find something else. It looks easy when it's distilled down to a YouTube video, and that shit is tough.
Yeah. It was eye-opening for me, man. And it's made me a better hunter, because to your earlier point, we focus so much of the scouting on finding the deer, where that's actually the easiest part. Like if you think about it, because they're laying down sign and they're telling you where they're at. They're telling you where they're spending time. They may not tell you exactly what time of year. That's like, you have to do your due diligence, maybe hang some cameras, do some observation sets, scout during the season, whatever the case is. But the finding the deer part is the easy part. The figuring out how to get in there close enough to get them killed without them knowing that you're there, that's where the scouting actually takes place, right? Because then it becomes, that's really when you're battling your wits against the deer's wits. You know what I mean? Because I think I know how you're using this area. I need to kind of pull a fast one on you, make you think I'm not there while I'm there, and try to use your senses against you. to a degree is what you're kind of doing, right? And then so that's a very much like a Pennsylvania or just like a timbered kind of approach, right? You see the sign, you know the deer's in the area, you figure out how you get your access, et cetera, et cetera. When you're in Kansas, those flat areas, finding the deer is really easy. It might take some driving around, right? But you're just glassing, sitting behind your binos, watching, and you're finding where they're at. And then becomes the chess match, right? Especially if you're out there during the rut. I might take your advice this year. I might go out in October. So we'll see. Because, during the rut, it's like, so you didn't just find a buck, most likely. You likely found a buck and 2 or 3 does that he's pushing around, right? If it's, a dominant buck. You might find some peckerheads running around by themselves or nudging a doe around, or running around like they're lost. But if it's a mature deer, at least what I've seen out there, they're pushing 2 or 3 around because there's a small doe group that has a hot doe in, and he's pushing them around, and eventually he's going to cut her out, but he's just pushing the whole group around until it comes time. And now you're trying to beat him, which he's not as hard to beat because he's kind of an idiot at that point. Still not easy. But then you've got his lady friend and whatever other lady friends that she might be hanging out with that you're having to beat at the same time. And that's where the game really kind of gets interesting. That's where you start to kind of, how far can I push the envelope? Is rattling going to work to try to entice him? Is decoying going to tick him off to get him to come in? That's when you have to start kind of reading the deer. So this is like the next level of scouting. It's not just find the deer. Okay, now I got in. The next step is I can't close the distance. How do I get him in range? Right. And so it's just, I've fallen in love with it because there's so many layers to that game that you don't sometimes get to play in timbered areas.
Man, you're so right on all this stuff. I want to back up a second and talk about the finding the deer thing that you went through just a little bit ago, because I think this is maybe the biggest disservice that widespread trail camera usage has given us. Like, it is not that hard to get a picture of a good buck. Like, I don't care where you live, where you hunt. If you got a little bit of horsepower between your ears, at some point in the summer or at some point in the fall, you can probably get a picture of a buck that would make you real happy. That might be a 110 somewhere and it might be a 170 somewhere else, but you can do it. And we've kind of convinced ourselves that that's good enough. Like, that's, we've got it figured out then. And it doesn't mean anything until you scout enough to figure out how to hunt them. Like, it doesn't, it's the same thing like you said about, if you're out in Kansas and you glass up 160 incher out there in the pasture, great. Like, what's next? Like, that's awesome. It's fun, but what's next? I mean, what it reminds me of, like, for a long time in the turkey hunting world, you'd hear people say like, oh, roosted is roasted. And then it kind of changed to like, roosted isn't necessarily roasted anymore. It's like, because it doesn't take that long for you to go out there and you have that bird gobbling his ass off 100 yards away and you don't kill him. And then it happens again and he doesn't fly down your decoys. And you go, okay, this is not enough. Like, there wasn't enough to my setup, or, like your example with a buck with a couple does, like you're competing with a bird that has a couple hens roosted with him. Now it's a different story. Like, so much of this stuff, we go, good enough. I found the scrape. I found the fence crossing they like. I got a picture of 3 big ones on this trail in August. It's over. And it's like, no, like, that's the start. And like, I'm continually reminded of that when I talk to guys like you and Andy May and some of these people who are real obsessed with scouting, because it's not, like, it's always starts with, I found this then. Like, I found him then, or I found this spot then. And then it goes into this long process, like maybe a multi-year process of like, now I got to figure out how to hunt it. Or somebody will be like, you drew your Kansas tag and you're like, oh my God, this world of hunting these plains deer is so vastly different. Like, it started there. Like, now all of a sudden this journey to scout started with just getting that tag, or like walking into the big woods when you're used to hunting, ag country and going, holy shit, like, I have a new world. But it doesn't hinge on just finding the deer and done. Like, that's just like you're opening the door. Like, you were standing on the porch, you knocked, they let you in, and now you got to go. Like, it's totally different.
Yeah. It's interesting because I've kind of done myself a disservice. Well, first I want to say, for people listening, like I'm not one of these guys it's like not a 170-inch deer or bust, right? It's whatever's going to get me excited. I'm not necessarily, I like big deer, don't get me wrong, but I'm not into the quote unquote horn porn. That's not my game. If a good 130 plus inch deer walks by me, out in Kansas, and I get a crack at him, awesome. I'm going to take a shot. But what you were kind of saying around the game just kind of beginning, like I kind of started my game almost completely over whenever I kind of tackled the big woods piece, and I started going to Kansas at the same time. So it was two brand new kind of areas, where I was like, I went into those seasons knowing that like it's going to be a while. You know what I mean? Like if I really want to consistently be able to hunt this big woods piece, I gotta be committed to it, and I just got to spend my time here and know that it's probably going to be a couple season endeavor before it happens. And then the Kansas piece was a big slice of humble pie, because I'd been to the Iowa and Ohio, and I've killed deer in those areas that have more target rich environment, more so than PA and stuff like that. And so I was like, Kansas, we should get it done. And this will be my third year back, and I've had 3 deer that I've been either at full draw on or within 15 yards and under. That the smallest one was like mid 140s, and being 15 yards or closer to a caliber of that deer on the ground and just not being able to get an arrow in him has just been extremely humbling, because it's one of those things where, the first year out there, like I was playing it all wrong. You know what I mean? Like I was just like one of those. It was like I turned 21 and someone took me to the strip club for the first time. Got a wad of ones. I'm like, what's up? That was how I was doing it, and I blew a bunch of hunts. And, the last day of that hunt, I actually had a really good deer, probably borderline 150-inch deer. And he got within 15 yards and he caught my thermal, and I was hung out to dry in the middle of nothing. And then last year, I had one that was, 140s, clean 8, awesome deer. It was a hunt on a whim at the head of a draw, working the wind correctly. And I clipped a small branch when I went to draw back. My arrow hit a small twig, and that was in front of me, and the arrow bounced off my rest, and he heard it and snapped his head around, and he was gone. I was at full draw on that deer. I've never wanted to throw a bow so bad in my life. Like that one almost went for a ride. Like I was so mad. And then, so this is where like the game comes in. So I started learning. I started being more patient. That's why I had that really good encounter there. And then the first day that I was there, I just glassed the whole first day I was there, and I kind of started figuring out how they were using the head of this one draw. And I saw the second day when I was taught, I walked in during a little bit of daylight, and I ended up glassing from about 200 yards away from me up the CRP toward the head of that draw. Like the reason why you go to Kansas. Like I ended up seeing him, I ended up being close enough to him. He was 160 plus odd inch, like mainframe 10, junk all over his bases, like awesome deer. And so I saw him, and from the previous year and watching him with those does, I knew that he was going to cut that doe out and he was going to go breeder. And I probably wasn't going to see him for like 3 to 5 days, roughly, right? Depending on like how close she was to being bred. He was going to lock down with her for 3, and that was, and then he'll be back. And so I ended up hunting a bunch of other areas because I didn't get a shot at him. I got about as close as 75 yards and couldn't rattle him in, and he walked off with her, and I didn't see him again. I kept an eye on that draw. Every day I would kind of check it. We didn't see him. And I was like, the last day of the hunt, I was like, this will be the day he should come off that doe. And so I just played it patient. I didn't bust up that draw. I didn't mess with it. I glassed it, just kept tabs on those deer, hunted some other spots. The last day I went up the head of that draw, stayed inside the draw because it was the last day I was going to be there, so I didn't care if my scent was on that draw anymore. Walked up the head of that draw, went to a tree that I'd picked out, this locust tree that he was kind of, when I'd seen him previously, he walked in front of it. When I glassed other deer, they were always walking in front of this one tree. So I'm using other deer to tell me what deer want to do in that spot, not necessarily just him. This is, again, where the scouting part comes in, right? It's like you're just trying to take the pieces that you can find. And I walked to that tree, walked up out of the draw, and there was a deer grunting to my right, and there was deer grunting to my left, and there was enough like moonlight just starting to get a little bit daylight to where I could start to see a little bit, and I saw deer out in front of me. And net was, there was a buck to my right that was grunting, there was a doe in front of me, and then there was the deer that I was after that was with her, and he was standing right behind the tree I was trying to get to. He's at 30 yards, and I can see his frame, And I'm just like, you got to be kidding me. What are the chances we both show up at the same spot at the same time? Right. I don't have enough shooting light. I tried to wait him out. He was kind of prancing around, getting nervous because that other buck was grunting. I never saw that buck. I just heard him grunting. And so I think he thought I was a deer because I had the back, like the darkness of the draw behind me. And he had like the skylight behind him. So I could see him. He couldn't see me. And my wind was in my favor. And so I think he thought I was a deer. So I started grunting, grabbed my grunt call and shuffling my feet and got behind a Charlie Brown Christmas tree. And I made it to that. And I got knelt down and got an arrow knocked. And I was like, if I can just get like another 5 minutes of daylight, and if I can get him to step in front of where I knew these saplings were, I was like, then I have a shot. And so I got the 5 minutes that I needed. He snort wheezed at me. He still thought I was a buck. I snort wheezed back at him. He postured up, started walking toward me, and he walked right to the edge of where those saplings were at and just stood there. He was at like 20 yards. And I just did not have enough light to get a clear pin to be able to one, have a clear pin, and two, be able to see exactly where those saplings were at, so I didn't like clip one and have a deflected arrow hit him and have a bad situation. So I ended up just watching him walk out of my life. But that's the humbling kind of nature of hunting somewhere like that and talking about like the game just starts when you find them. It's the scouting you have to do in between to figure out how you're going to put yourself with like in their world. Yeah. Right. It's not being on their planet. You know what I mean? Like I want to be in his house, and so that's where the game really kind of comes into play. And then when I left that night, it was the last night in Kansas, I'm driving out and I saw him in my headlights and he's running beside my truck, full Kansas gallop through a cut cornfield, chasing a doe right beside me. And I just see like all these antlers. And that was when I got the best look at him because I was like right on top of him. I was like, you gotta be freaking kidding me.
You bring up a point we don't talk about very often. Like I wrote an article last month for Meat Eater, and I've been pounding this drum pretty hard about finding another place to hunt. And so, what you're talking about is something not everybody can do, right? Like not everybody's going to leave Pennsylvania and go hunt Kansas. Like a lot of people are staying home, right?
Yeah.
And the goal that we've been shown in whitetail hunting for so long is get a spot you can manage and make it so you don't have to scout anymore. They're going to come to the food plot. They're going to go through certain, terrain traps or whatever, run some cameras, keep tabs on them, but you don't have to scout anymore. But you don't necessarily get a lot better without getting your ass kicked. Like when you're talking about your first time in Kansas and you're doing everything wrong, that's like a powerful motivator to figure new stuff out that you can bring home with you, and you don't need to travel 17 states away to do it. Like I think one of the biggest problems people have with whitetails is we limit ourselves to our spot. Like I hunt this place, this farm or whatever, and it's like great, like that's great, but like how are you limiting yourself? Like are you limiting yourself on opportunities? If you have like the 40 acres you hunt and there's 10,000 acres of public land down the road, like you could probably level up your game a lot, scouting wise and hunting wise, by putting yourself in that position where you're like, I don't know what's going on here and I have to figure it out. I think that's like one of the things, you hear a lot of like negativity out there on people in the hunting industry and being like, oh, they're ruining everything. And I'm like, whatever, right? That's a different topic. But I also look at it and I go, right, these are some of the best hunters you're ever going to meet in your life because they're going to places all the time where they have no history, where they have to scout on the fly or they have to really bring up their e-scouting game and figure it out. And we can all do that on some level. Yeah, you might not be able to go hunt 7 states a year, like most people can't, but you might be able to find a place an hour down the road, or maybe you live in, southern Michigan and you could hunt northern Michigan. Like maybe you could do something that's still on your resident tag, but forces you to go, I'm not just going to go sit on the same cornfields. I'm not going to go sit on the same ponds. Like I'm going to go scout and figure this stuff out. Because when you start challenging yourself that way, man, things change. And you get your ass kicked a lot, but you're getting better while you're doing it.
Yeah. And to me, as odd as it might sound, getting my ass handed to me is part of what I like about some of these trips and hunting in these different areas. To your point, man, like you don't need to travel 3, 6, 5, however many states away. Just finding a pocket of your home state that just offers a different a different scenario, is often enough. Like for me, I look forward, like even like locally, I don't hunt the same spots over and over again. Like I can only think of 1-2 spots all of last season locally that I've hunted in the past. Like every other spot that I hunted last year was a fresh sit, was new. Like I'd scouted it. I'd hung a camera, checked cameras in the summer, scouted in the summer a little bit, and then just went in and hunted it. Right. And that's just kind of what I like to do. I want to fill this freaking Kansas tag this year because I want to go to a different state, and I'm determined to fill the tag fill a Kansas tag before I venture off to another state, because I've never been to Nebraska. I want to go to Nebraska. I've never been to Oklahoma. I want to go to Oklahoma. I've never been to Minnesota. I want to go to Minnesota. Never been to Wisconsin. I want to go there. You know what I mean? So I just like to experience brand new stuff. And for me, going back to what we said earlier, adaptability being your best ability, I just always want to kind of keep that at the forefront and force myself to continue to adapt. Because whenever I'm in comfortable areas, it makes that willingness to be uncomfortable and have to adapt makes the game a little easier in some of those spots that I have familiarity with. And that's why I think, there's a time and place for everything, whether it's food plot, building, a smarter mousetrap. And I think that for people who have access to that, I think that's great. I think that's a great way to kind of start to understand what deer like to do, because you maybe see deer more often, right? Because I know you and I've talked about, like, you got to be around deer to learn deer, right? So if you have a hard time finding deer and you have a situation like that where you can just be around deer and observe and watch, like that's a great way to kind of cut your teeth and then take it into, like, a piece of big woods or like the piece of public land that's close to your home or whatever, and then start to see how some of what you knew starts to fall apart maybe just a little bit, and then what parts you have to kind of like sharpen because there were skills that you had, but they weren't quite where they needed to be, honestly, to kill a deer that everyone else has access to, or that's not set up for you to put them in a certain spot where they're doing exactly what they want to do and you're on their terms, And so I think there's a time and place for stuff, but I 100% agree with you, man. It's like when you force yourself to go do unfamiliar stuff, you have no choice but to get better. Like that's when you're uncomfortable, you're growing. If you're comfortable, then you're not progressing. It's kind of like the old saying.
Oh man. And what you find out when you do that, and I don't care if you are traveling 7 states away or you're hunting something, a farm down the road you've never hunted before.
100%.
You start to, like you said, realize the things that you believed are bullshit. And man, your obsession is getting that Kansas tag out of the way and moving on to another state. I really got sucked into this Western Minnesota thing. So I hunted there last year for a few days during the rut, got my ass handed to me, saw a few does, couldn't even get a forky near me. Like really, really got roughed up by it. But I'm like, I'm around them. And then I went back and pheasant hunted a whole bunch again, which is the reason I wanted to hunt there. And I'm pheasant hunting properties that I deer hunted, and I'm jumping bucks, and it's pissing me off because I'm seeing good deer right where I was hunting. And I go, people have told me my whole life it's not worth deer hunting here. And then I go pheasant hunt there, and I'm seeing good deer consistently. Then I go deer hunt there, and I get my ass kicked. And so I go, the disconnect here is not that there aren't good deer to hunt or enough deer to hunt or whatever, enough public land to hunt. It's all there. All of that is available. The disconnect was it's just really hard. And so it's easier to say it's not worth it than to actually go try to figure it out. But once you kind of get your claws stuck into something like that, it gets hard to not want to get better. And, because I think, and this is not everybody. Like I have buddies who they're like wired so vastly different from me for deer. Like they want a very consistent, pretty easy place to hunt. And that's like good for them. Like it's like they're working hard in their life and they want to go sit in a tree stand where they know if they put in their time, he's coming by. But for a lot of people, I think, especially if if you're listening to this podcast or reading articles or whatever, you're looking to level up. Like you're looking to get this stuff figured out. And man, hunting a new place is one way to get you to reframe your entire thought process on whitetails and kind of get rid of that stuff that you believe that just isn't true and start figuring out what is true. And like that process doesn't end. Like you start getting hooked on it and you're like, I want this more. And it just not only does it help you become a better deer killer, it just makes deer hunting more enjoyable. Like you're just problem solving.
And for me too, in like a weird way, it like when I have that type of experience, I just feel way more connected to the moment. I'm able to stay present more, if that makes sense. And like that's been like kind of a mantra for me this year is like, you know, trying to be, you know, more present just in general, like in my day-to-day life, in hunting, being aware, you know, of my body's capabilities, you know, my capabilities, you know, as a human, as a hunter. And I kind of, I don't want to say long, it seems like a weird dramatic word, but like I do long for that like primal connection. And to me, like whenever I go out and I get lost in these places and I have to kind of figure it out, like that's when I feel connected. As weird as that might sound, like knowing jack shit is when I feel most connected, you know? And so much so that like I've toyed around with the idea of like switching to a trad bow just for the sole purpose of it being more primitive and being more connected, and it becomes part of me, and there's not really anything mechanical, and there's nothing wrong with, I shoot a normal, you know, vertical bow, you know, and I'm not poo-pooing that because, you know, it's hard enough to try to do it with that. But like I'm yearning this primal connectivity that I seem to get whenever I'm in places like Kansas and I feel like I'm out of my element a little bit and I'm on the ground, you know. And that's the other part that I love about it. When you go to these different places, they call for different tactics. You know, Kansas was a big switch for me because like I really never hunted on the ground much at all, you know, except whenever I would hunt like elk or mule deer or whatever. And so it made me get proficient at being able to be on the ground and hunt, you know. And so now it's like I don't shy away from those ground setups when I'm in Pennsylvania. You know, it's like if there's a good spot and nobody can get to it and there's no trees, I'm like, this seems like a pretty good spot, right? Like, because shouldn't be a lot of pressure in here. And so it makes you kind of, you know, basketball players would say like, you know, makes you, you know, get a bigger bag. You know, it's like you got a lot more handle, you know what I mean, so to speak, right? You know, and so that's the other thing that I think it does, not just from like an academic kind of like mental, how you process this stuff because it's new standpoint, but you start adding things to your arsenal, because if not, that hunt is going to be really long and hard, you know, until you start to try some of that stuff. And then, you know, the other part of it for me is just the connection to the challenge, you know, and the personal connection to it. And it seems like the longer I go, the harder I want to make it, because that's whenever I feel most connected and I feel most present is whenever. Do you ever notice how whenever you're doing something really hard, like you become laser focused, like where you almost don't hear other stuff outside of you?
Yep.
You know what I mean? And when something's really easy or comes naturally, right, you start to get distracted by things, right? And I think that's the one thing that I've really kind of come to understand and try to implement through, like, you know, training jiu-jitsu, is that idea of like when something is really, really tough and I have to really try, man, my focus is laser sharp. And whenever it's not and something's easy, I don't perform as well.
Yep.
You know, so I meet the challenge, and then I will perform down to my opponent, if you will, right? My best roles in the gym are always against guys who are way better than me. Not a surprise, because I'm trying to keep up, right? Same thing with deer hunting. It's like if I'm at some place that's lazy, you know, just say at home, I'm a worse deer hunter at home than I am on the road, like 100%.
Oh man, that is something you learn so fast when you travel to hunt, is how much you phone it in when you're at a place you think you know. Yep. I mean, it's crazy. And you mentioned, you know, kicking around the idea of hunting with a trad bow, and you know, hunting, you know, going to Kansas, you know, all of a sudden I got to sit on the ground. All of a sudden I'm gonna decoy when you might never pick up a decoy in the big woods of Pennsylvania, right? Like all of a sudden you're out of your comfort zone. You're doing things different. I hunted for a few years with a trad bow back when I was in my 20s, and I'll tell you what, man. When you hear people talk about it and they go, well, you know, I'm not shooting a bow with training wheels on it, like you always think it's just tied to like the distance that you can be accurate, right? Yeah. That's part of it. You know, like when you've got a recurve or a longbow up there, you're like, I want him at 15 yards, quartered away, and I want that dreamy shot. You know, like you're not sitting on the edge of a bean field ranging it and go, well, if he comes through that row, he's 35 yards, I'll dial into that and shoot him. It's a different thing that way. But what really messed me up, or at least forced me to rethink my setups, was if you've got a recurve and it's, 55 inches tip to tip or 60 inches, whatever it is, that shot that you would take behind the tree with a compound, you don't have it.
Yeah.
You can't get around there. Or, it depends how you hold. I can't my bow, so I take up a lot of space. I'm not shooting straight up and down. Or just like when you're on the ground, like, you're going to go get in a ground blind and do this now? Good luck, right? Like, can't do it. You just have to think like, now how do I structure my setup so not only is he going to be there at that range, I'm going to actually be able to draw on him and shoot him. It's a different thing. And I haven't done it in a long time. I'm going to go back eventually, probably when my job isn't tied to killing stuff. But it forced me to look at everything differently. And I didn't think it would. I'm kind of seeing the same thing taking my daughters when they crossbow hunt. I'm like, it's such an advantage that now it sort of takes away like 3 layers of difficulty. When you don't have to worry about drawing, okay. Like, you know what I mean? So like, that goes a different way. But all of it forces you to think like, man, what I was comfortable with, one little variation in weapon or one little variation in like hunting styles, now you've got to problem solve in a totally different way. And it, like you said, it brings you into the moment. And I think that stuff's important.
It 100% is, man. And it's like, I don't know if it's, getting older or whatever it is, but, the longer I do this and maybe for me too, like this year, I kind of had a focus of some other stuff that I was, focusing on trying to get better at. And I think it allowed me to kind of look at hunting a little bit differently. I think for a while I was getting wrapped up, it was all consuming, and I'm not saying it like that, you shouldn't be dedicated and passionate about it, because I love bow hunting, right? But there's also a part of like, you sometimes need things that pull you away slightly. That way, whenever you get in it, that the passion and everything is there, right? Because you and I have talked about this. Like, there's parts of this that suck. You know what I mean? There's parts of this that are a grind, right? And to pretend that it's all rainbows and unicorns and stuff like that is a false narrative. And I was finding myself there where I was like, I love this stuff, but like it's starting to wear on me a little bit, because I do like hard hunts. You know what I mean? I do like the challenging stuff, and that's the part that I love. But there's a part of me that's like, I'm like, okay, this is getting brutal. You know what I mean? Like, And so I had to kind of, you and I've talked, like I started training a lot of jiu-jitsu, and that's the thing that kind of took me away from it, not away from it, but allowed me to kind of divert my attention to where it's like I wasn't so obsessed. And that distance actually gave me more clarity, and like you'll hear a lot about this type of stuff and like leadership stuff. And it applies whenever you're talking about deer hunting. It's like whenever things are kind of getting rough or whatever, it's like you need to detach and assess, right? You need to be able to step back from yourself and almost look at yourself as though you're like a ghost, and go like, what's going on here? Like, what part of this is the part that you don't get joy out of any longer, right? And then define what that is. I'm not saying that there was loss of joy in deer hunting or whatever, but like what aspects were starting to grind on me, you know what I mean? And make me, not love it as much as I maybe did 3 years ago. And it was that assessment where I was like, okay, cool. Let's just cut that shit out. Yep. And awesome. And now it's gone, and the part that I cut out was actually a personal thing where I felt compelled that I needed to be always doing something for it. Otherwise I was slacking. Right. And it was that idea that, and then what I realized was that I was doing that because I felt like these external pressures of like, whether it was because I have a hunting podcast or whatever the case, I don't know exactly where they came from, but I was like, that's just, no one's expecting me to do that. I'm doing that to myself.
Yep.
And so once I removed that, and was like, I'll do this on my time, when I feel like it, and whenever I want to do it, as opposed to whenever I feel obligated to do it, and that was really and so it wasn't like I spent any less time doing it or thinking about it. It's just like, I allowed myself to be free to do it whenever the mood struck, and it brought the joy back to it again. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so for me, that was like the idea of like the trad bow and stuff like that. Cause I was like, I don't care if someone thinks that, I'm killing something smaller than I should because I'm using a trad bow, or I blew an opportunity because I'm using a trad bow. It's like, I want the experience. Don't care what the other person thinks. You know what I mean? It's like, And that was kind of like, it was good for me, like to kind of detach, train jujitsu. That's also a mental shift too that really helps. And now it's like I was sending you deer pictures, man. It's like I'm geeked, man. It's like this season I'm like super pumped for. Like I'm just like probably more excited for this upcoming season than I've been probably in the past two.
Dude, I love that. And I think, when you talk about when you start to feel that this stuff sucks and it starts to be not fun. I mean, and if you're listening to this and you haven't hit that stage yet, just wait. It's coming. It's just sitting right up over the hill waiting for you to walk over, man. It's coming. And for me, a change of scenery does me really well, like a new kind of challenge, but also just learning to trust the process. Because we always think like, if only I do this or if only I do that, or if like it's going to happen. And the truth is, it's probably not. Like you're probably going to keep failing no matter what. But if you learn, just like anything, like working out or anything, like if you learn the long game process and you go, there's a lot of suck built into this, but the reward is coming, then it's like, it's easier to just go, okay, I know I got to do this. I got to run these cameras, or I got to go look at this, or I got to glass for the night, or I got to do the process. I got to give myself that shot, because if I do that, like eventually the reward's going to come, and it might not be $7 this year. It might be 1 or 2 good encounters or whatever. It might lead you 2 seasons down the road where you kill 3 of them in 3 states and you have an amazing season, and then you start over. Like, but you learn that it's like, this is what it takes. It's the same thing. Like if you struggle with like depression and you're like, I got to figure out a way to manage this better. One of the things a lot of people learn is I need to move my body and wear myself out. Like it's not the only answer a lot of times, but it's like, I don't want to run. I don't want to run 5 days a week, but I know that sucky part's going to make me feel better overall and be a better person. Like I don't have a choice. Like I got to trust that process to get myself into a better place. Deer hunting is exactly the same. Like if you're not hunting a banging property where you can just count on them showing up, you got to figure out that process of scouting and scout to learn how to hunt specific spots, not just find the deer. The process will deliver for you eventually. And once it starts to, it's like, okay, at least I have a template. When I start veering off and I start feeling really shitty or like I need that break or whatever, that's fine. You can return to the process.
Yeah. I mean, there's no shortcuts, right? It's one of those things that's very akin to like working out, running, jujitsu, or whatever it is, where there's not like a, pass go collect $200 and all of a sudden like everything's good to go. It just doesn't happen that way. It'd be nice if it did, but it's just not the truth of the matter. And there's a lot of suck that's built into it. And sometimes you said, you mentioned something there about scouting, and I was just thinking, I was like, sometimes you have to scout to learn how to scout, to where you're not going to do it right the first time. You know what I mean? Or the second time, or the third time. It's going to take doing it over and over again to where you start to see like where the shortcomings are, right? And sometimes you're fortunate that you have someone who's close to you or that who can point your shortcomings out to kind of help you expedite that part of it. If not, you'll still get there. It might just take you a little longer. And that doesn't matter. I think people get, hung up also like in the idea that like it has to happen within a certain amount of time, And that was probably like the biggest learning lesson with like the training stuff that I've been doing, is that people don't advance at the same rate. There's a lot of reasons why people, even if two people commit, jujitsu at the same time, same body size, same strength, same everything, and they train the same amount of days, doesn't mean they're going to advance the same rate. And so you can't get hung up on like this person that you started with or that's around your skill level or whatever is advancing more quickly than you, right? It's all about your personal journey. And it's interesting, once you start focusing on that journey, all of a sudden the advancing happens, like, I won't say overnight, but all of a sudden you start to see it, like it comes in spades. And I feel like hunting's kind of the same way. Whereas when you start, if you're comparing your journey to somebody else, you're always going to lose. Yeah. Because you don't have the same, even if everything you can kind of put your finger on is the same, it's not the same. Your inputs, if you will, right?
Yep.
And so you're always going to feel like you're not enough, when you're measuring yourself against someone else because they're advancing more quickly than you or they're achieving more than you are. But if you frame it in, am I a better deer hunter this year than I was last year? Then you're moving in the right direction. And then that's all you need to be worried about is just, what is your journey? How are you being fulfilled? How are you enjoying the process? What parts of the process don't you like? Then don't do them. You know what I mean? You don't have to do them. You know what I mean? It's just you find what works for you and you focus on the path that you're kind of creating and not the other paths people are creating for themselves. That's a losing battle. And once you start doing that, it's all of a sudden the amount of joy you would expect is there. And then something funny happens is that all of a sudden the results show up too.
Yep. Dude, you start not taking it so seriously and you start having fun, the big bucks start dying. And it's a hard place to get to, man.
Yeah, it's not a not caring, because I think that sometimes people get it and misinterpret it with like having fun and not caring. It's like, no, you care, but it's like you don't live and die with the end result. You appreciate the journey.
Yep.
And that's like you could equate like big bucks to like a black belt, right? It's like there's a saying, in jiu-jitsu that anyone who ever wanted to become a black belt did, because all it ever is takes this time and commitment, right? Anyone who ever wanted to kill a booner, really ever wanted to kill a booner, did, right? Because it just took time and focus on that thing, and eventually it'll happen, And so that's kind of like what my new approach has been that.
My new approach is mostly just take my kids and then hunt when I can and shoot whatever walks by, and I freaking love it. And although I'll tell you what, man, like we talked about like traveling to new places and scouting new stuff. And then you were just talking about like finding the things you enjoy there. It's not like you're going to find styles of scouting or find some kind of terrain that you just love to hunt and that's the end, because you'll drift away. Or over time, something will be like, I'm not that into this anymore. I need something else. So like you have to understand that it's like all happiness, right? It's a moving target, man. Like you hit it today and you won't hit it tomorrow, but you got to keep looking. And I found that, I hunted a lot of public land for like a decade. Like a bunch of states. I had a good run, but I was burned, man. Like I was like, I'm sick of driving. I'm sick of camping. I'm sick of like the pressure. And, for the last couple of years with Meat Eater, I've had to save tags and it's been different seasons than I'm used to. And so I was like, this is kind of a relief. I don't feel the pressure to go kill a bunch of stuff on public land. And what I found was that's actually kind of what I need to be happy. Like I went to South Dakota and we filmed a hunt with the Element Boys, the buck truck deal, and didn't go that well. I had a pretty decent hunt, had one really good encounter at the end, but I told my wife when I got home, I'm like, I'm going back without a camera guy and I'm going to go figure this out because I just needed it. And I went back and I had another, 130 incher come in, super close, screwed that up, but I left it going, even though I didn't fill my tag, I left it going like, that was what I needed. Like it just, it made me feel good. Like I'm like, okay, I got to have that kind of thing mixed in there. Otherwise the whole thing doesn't work for me. Right. And figuring the more of that stuff you figure out, the better it is to just go, okay, like, man, I'm veering off a little bit. I'm in the ditch. Like I'm in the rhubarb. Like I need to correct here and get back up onto the road. And if you know where that is, it's awesome to like try that stuff and figure out new things. Cause you always kind of go, okay, like I know where my true north is. Like I know what baseline I need to just enjoy this and always find what I'm looking for out there. I think that's so like that matters.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that, people will, kind of jump around or experience different things. Like they would never want to eat the same food every day. We'll use that as an example, right? And so when you think about like how you kind of find like happiness or joy in something like that, to expect to find it consistently in the same spot in deer hunting, seems crazy if you think about it, right? Because you don't find that. If someone said like, even when I was a musician and was doing that, right, and that was kind of like my gig, and that was all I ever wanted to do when I was a kid growing up. Like that was it. Like that was my passion. And I finally got to do it, 8, 9, 10 years of doing it, all of a sudden it became a job, and yeah, I still enjoyed it. It was about as lackadaisical, loose job as you could possibly have, being a delinquent. But there was an element of work to it that started sucking the joy out of it. You know what I mean? Because it became the thing that you had to do, and it was a certain type of music, and I was expected to write a certain way because that was what we were, had a record deal for, or whatever. That was what, the producer was expecting, or the management was expecting, or whatever the case was. And so it's crazy to think that hunting's not the same. And that's something that I've kind of, realized and kind of been spending more time paying attention to, because, you asked me when we first started, like, about private land or any private land or whatever. And yeah, family owns some back home. And I've been thinking a lot recently, like, why am I not going back and spending time with my dad, like hunting his property with him? You know what I mean? Like, is it because I feel so compelled that I've got to do this public land thing because that's what I really like to do? Or should I be hunting with the old man because that will bring me a different type of joy that I probably haven't had since I was a kid, And he wants to go do an elk hunt, and I don't like using outfitters. And he only wants to go use an outfitter because he's an older fellow. He wants the comforts, you know what I mean? And we've kind of put it off because I'm like, Dad, let's do a public land piece. I got a buddy who's got like a cabin we can stay at, And then I'm thinking like, dude, you're an asshole. Like your dad wants to go do an elk hunt with you at some outfitter. Like, get off your wallet and spend a couple bucks to go make a memory. You know what I mean? And don't be a douche. You know what I mean? And so it's like, and I'm being honest with people that are listening here. It's like I've been very selfish in that regard, And to me, I think when I think about things, part of what was driving me a little crazy whenever I did that step back and kind of reevaluate was like I recognized the selfishness that I had in this, and that was the other part that was starting to suck the joy out of it for me. And so it was that commitment to like, man, spend time with the buddies, go hunt with your dad. Even if it's a good weather day and there's a deer somewhere that you could try to go kill, like still go hunt with the old man, even though you're probably not going to see jack shit. You know what I mean? Like, so it's just stuff like that, and I don't know if it's like being an adult, or, being a parent with a teenage daughter or what, because I'm thinking in the back of my mind, even if it's not hunting related, like when she's my age, and I hope she would make the choice to spend time with me, and so I need to give her the roadmap for that. She needs to see me do it. She needs to see me be committed to spending time with my dad, as we're both getting older and stuff like that. And I know that Mark's been doing like this series on parenting and stuff like that, so I don't feel completely out of place mentioning that.
Well, I mean, it just changes you, man. Taking your kids hunting, or you get to a certain age and you realize like the big buck thing is kind of dumb. Like it's way overrated. Yep. It's not that important.
Fun, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's just more to the experience than that, and you kind of realize how much of a gift this whitetail hunting thing really is. I think that's a great way to end this, man. Where can everybody find your podcast, the website, all that good stuff, social?
Yeah, it's Truth from the Stand on all the different social platforms and wherever you like to waste your time running down the rabbit hole. On YouTube, it's Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast, all the places that you find, all the places you'll find podcasts.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, buddy. That's it for this week, folks. Be sure to tune in next week for more whitetail goodness. This has been Wired to Hunt, and I'm your guest host, Tony Peterson. As always, I just want to thank you so much for your support and for sticking with us through, I don't know how many hundreds of episodes now. It's bananas. But we really do appreciate that you guys show up every week and you give us this support. So thank you for that. If you want more whitetail content, head on over to themeateater.com. You can see articles that I've written. You can see articles by Mark, Alex Gilstrom, Dylan Tramp, Bo Martonic, whole bunch of whitetail killers. Tony Hansen's in there in the mix too. Or you can, if you have a short attention span or you just like watching stuff, you can check out The Buck Truck, a new series that we dropped pretty recently that was produced by the Element Boys, who are absolute public land whitetail killers as well. If you like hunting, if you like fishing, there's some content there for you that you're going to love somehow, somewhere. Go find it at themeateater.com.
As you know, the Meat Eater live tour is on April 23rd through May 5th. Chances are in a town near you. What you may not know is you can win tickets to each of these events just by going to a backcountry hunters and anglers pint night. There's going to be a pint night in each of these towns: San Diego, Salt Lake City, Tempe, Anaheim, Boise, Sacramento, Missoula, Portland, Tacoma, where you can compete in meat eater trivia and win not only tickets to the show, but a chance to be on stage with all of us. So get your butt to a pint night, and we'll see you on stage.